Welcome to the Journal of the Oxford Graduate Theological Society YouTube page. My name is Callaway, and I am the editor of the journal. I'm joined today by two other members of the editorial board, Victoria Phillips and Mimi Nicholson on tech. Today, we are privileged to speak with Canon Professor Michael Snape, the Michael Ramsey Professor of Anglican Studies at Durham University. Professor Snape is, among other roles, an ecumenical lay canon of Durham Cathedral, co-founder of the International Network for the Study of War and Religion in the Modern World, and the official historian of the Royal Army Chaplains Department. His research in modern religious and military history has resulted in a handsome collection of journal articles and book chapters, as well as full-length monographs, including, most recently, God and Uncle Sam, Religion and America's Armed Forces in World War II, and just last year, A Church Militant, Anglicans and the Armed Forces from Queen Victoria to the Vietnam War. His forthcoming book is entitled Forgotten Warrior, The Life and Times of Major General Merton Beckwith Smith, 1890 to 1942. So, without further ado, welcome, Professor Snape, and thank you for joining us. It's very good to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
To begin with, how did you first become interested in this work? Was there an aha moment in your life that made you recognize your desire to pursue this line of inquiry?
No, there wasn't any kind of spontaneous sense of inspiration. I think one of the things that always struck me growing up in the latter decades of the 20th century was the number of people around me who had actually undertaken some kind of military service. My father, my grandfather, neither of whom were professional soldiers, but that was a common pattern in the UK at the time, even though we'd never had a Vietnam experience and conscription had ended in 1963. There were still plenty of people around who'd been in the First World War, in the Second World War, or who had undertaken national service in the post-Second World War years. And that was a phenomenon which, of course, has left us in British society today. There's a far, far smaller percentage of Britons would have immediate contact with family members who had served in any capacity. But in my own generation, it was quite common. And I was always struck by the faith lives of people who had experienced military service, who had experienced conflict. And I was glad of the opportunity to begin to write about their experiences in a way which seemed to me at the time, back at the beginning of this century, as perhaps a little more objective than some of the writing which had dominated the historiography up to that point. So there was no Damascene moment, as it were. It was really just a sense of being able to do this, and really to a degree of having the permission to write in that particular vein. I began my academic career in 1994 in the post-Cold War era, the era of international optimism, a great deal of faith in multilateralism, in the UN, etc. And the end of the Cold War seemed to confirm a very established narrative in the history of modern Western Christianity and conflict, which essentially required what was basically a fundamentally pacifist take on the subject, that the role of the historian was to be critical of the mistakes, in inverted commas, which had been made in the past, and to basically call out church leaders for their failings, which served as object lessons, particularly in the Cold War era. And I was quite keen to actually diverge from that, because I don't think it did justice to the whole panorama of experience and perspective.
Hmm. So did you, so from your undergraduate days through to your postgraduate training, did you kind of know this is what you were interested all the way through, and it kind of shaped your research questions and ideas, or did it evolve?
No, it didn't. I mean, I mentioned permission to write in a particular vein, to look at this subject from a particular perspective. And to be honest, as a postgraduate student, I didn't think I had permission to write actually on this subject. Military history of any kind in many academies, certainly in the English-speaking world, is to say the very least a Cinderella subject, often shunned implicitly and even explicitly. And my original research, which I loved, don't get me wrong, and which I felt very fulfilled by, was looking at Anglican life, or the life of members of the Church of England in 18th century England, in the northwest of England, in the era of growing industrialization. I love that research, but it was really my former supervisor, Professor Hugh MacLeod at Birmingham, who knew I had an interest in this sort of thing. And he was a series editor of a series on Christianity and the modern world for Routledge. And he asked me back in 1996, 1997, if I would be interested in writing a volume for that series on war and religion. And I thought, well, this is my opportunity, really. And I was very grateful for that chance at that time to write in that particular way. So that's really what happened.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, let's talk a little bit about kind of your more current research. So in your recent book, Church Militant, you cover an expansive epoch, which includes, for example, colonial and decolonization conflicts, the two world wars, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. Based on your surveys of these specific conflicts, are there any theological and or religious issues, themes, or doctrines that have contributed to the onset and duration of these wars, such that you would now consider them to be recurrent or common to acts of warfare more generally?
Thank you for that question. I have to say that I'm not a theologian, let alone a systematic theologian. So I'm really speaking as a historian here, but I can single out a tendency, as it were, for theology to be reactive to the situation of conflict. And there are a couple of headline themes that strike me certainly from the British experience in that context. One of the things, of course, which impacted British Protestantism very heavily in the First World War was the question of the afterlife and prayers for the dead. Now, prayers for the dead were extremely rare, even in the Church of England, let alone the free churches, or indeed Scottish Presbyterianism or Irish Presbyterianism or the Church of Ireland before the First World War. But the pastoral need to provide comfort to relatives who had lost young men overwhelmingly as soldiers in the trenches of the Western Front and elsewhere really forced a nascent reconsideration of the whole concept or doctrine of the communion of saints, the efficacy of prayers for the dead. And so what had been a controversial practice, for example, in the Church of England in 1914 was widely accepted as standard practice by 1918. There were some bumps along the way. There were protests in 1917 by a couple of evangelical bishops about forms of prayer which had been issued under the authority of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, for prayers to be said on the third anniversary of the outbreak of the war. That's August 1917. There were objections that these forms of prayer included explicit prayers for the dead. But by 1918, even those protests had died away. And now, although it's often fudged, we remember before God, as it were, the idea of praying for, or at least moving in that direction, praying for the dead, particularly the war dead, is something which is very common practice, particularly in the Church of England. So that's one reactive element. I think one of the things that's also been overlooked in our understanding of how theological themes are shaped to meet the requirements or the needs of wartime situations is the theme of sacrifice. It's often argued that church leaders, particularly in the First World War, emphasized the need to go out and kill Germans. There's a rather spurious story that the Bishop of London delivered a sermon in 1915 in which he exhorted his listeners to kill Germans. And that's not only, in a sense, a mistake in terms of its misreading of what actually happened, but the dominant theological theme which seems to have fed into army morale during both world wars, and to a large extent still feeds into military morale today, is the need to sacrifice oneself, the need to be prepared to sacrifice for a greater end. The idea that somehow one's service, one's sacrifice is something that will help to create a better world, which in a sense is redemptive and therefore Christ-like. And I think that this is a very interesting theme which commentators have overlooked, that if one looks at what sermon literature has survived from military chaplains, British military chaplains in the First World War, the emphasis is on sacrifice, not on going out and killing the enemy. And I think that that particular theme has tremendous traction. And even speaking to chaplains today and looking at the literature which exists on the British military, this still has tremendous traction in military circles. So I think those themes, prayers to the dead, sacrifice, one could also go on and say one of the key themes to arise out of the First World War in terms of theology was the concept of the suffering God. This, of course, is something which Sir Kennedy popularized in his very colloquial fashion. Sir Kennedy being a very famous British Army chaplain, otherwise known as Woodbine Willie. Through The Hardest Part, published in 1918, he popularized the notion of the suffering God. And this is something which, of course, Jürgen Moltmann seized hold of and ran with, particularly in the 60s and 70s. So now it's a theological commonplace. But at the time, in the years of the First World War, it was earth-shaking in terms of what Sir Kennedy was proposing about the nature of God and the concern of God for the suffering of humanity.
Yeah,
and the involvement of God.
I was just wondering. Going back to what you were saying about the theme of sacrifice, do you find that your research has shown that it's more of emphasis on in Anglican circles the sacrifice of Christ, or do they invoke a lot of different passages of Scripture? Like, for example, do they talk about like Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, or is it normally centered around Christ?
In many respects, it's a mix, to be honest. There's a very kind of hybrid approach taken. If you think of the way in which the cross, in terms of British military memorialization, still symbolizes, is still the central symbol of sacrifice for acts of commemoration. There have been attempts afoot by humanists to try and displace or secularize this kind of cult of memorialization, remembrance. I can't see it working because it's so ingrained in the way things are done. I think one of the dangers, obviously, of this particular tendency is to allied the suffering of the serviceman or woman with the suffering of Christ. And that, of course, and the redemptive sacrifice of Christ on Calvary. This is something which theologians and church people in the First World War, when this sort of discourse was popularized, felt very uneasy with. And it's very easy to see why they feel uneasy with that elision. But sacrifices are made indirectly if you look at the architecture of the Commonwealth War Grave Commission cemeteries, which are famous and in many respects prototypical of military cemeteries throughout the world. If you look at the cross of sacrifice that stands in the middle of each one of these, deliberately named and actually designed by a son of the Bishop of London, of one Bishop of London. And also, if you think of the Stone of Remembrance, which is also situated in Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries, that to a certain extent is not only altar-like, but it also, I think, alludes to the potential sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, the willingness of one generation to see another sacrificed, because the call of the divine is so strong and requires that. So I think that the tropes of sacrifice drawn from several quarters, I mean, in many respects, for example, the sacrifice of Christian martyrs was invoked certainly in the First World War by leading British Army chaplains who were preachers. And so, yeah, the idea of sacrifice in Christianity flows from many different quarters, and all of these quarters are appropriated in the purpose of, or for the purpose of explaining the need for perseverance and the need for sustaining the suffering which war inevitably entails.
That's great. So also in your recent book, the concluding chapter contains some early reflections on the war in Ukraine in the months after it began. So it has been nearly a year since you penned these reflections. As this war in the Ukraine has evolved over the past months, which reflections of yours stick out to you as especially significant? And how would you assess or change those reflections now, do you think?
Well, that's very interesting because the postscript to the book is is really something which I never anticipated writing, and was written on the hoof as the book was going through production. But I think the themes that I raised, the ideas, the questions, the critique, in many respects has stood the test of time, given the direction that the war has taken. I was critical of the way in which what is effectively a functional pacifism had taken over, not just the outlook of the Church of England, but many mainstream churches in the West, and how that left them ill prepared to really comment on the act of naked aggression that was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And the game of catch up has been quite interesting. I mean, we've seen, for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's leery of using the term just war, but he said only last week that Ukraine's defense of itself, its own nationhood, has to be defended, has to be supported by the West, that the act of invasion was an act of monumental evil. This was a language which echoes that which was used by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York on the day of the invasion. So there is, as it were, a movement towards accepting that in certain circumstances there is a need to actually arm and sustain a particular war effort. Now, this is moving somewhat from the dominant mood music, let's say, of the Church of England's view of war in the early years of the century, in the light of Iraq, arguably even of Afghanistan as well. But I think that given that this is a war which could well last for a number of years, and on whose outcome could turn a further invasion of Taiwan by China, we are living in a world which is haunted by the sort of state-on-state conflict which we were told was not going to happen after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it has returned with a vengeance. And I think the churches really need to re-engage with the just war tradition to actually come to terms with a consistent and Christian perspective on conflict today. Obviously, there is the nuclear shadow. There are all sorts of complications which generations in the past, or certainly before 1945, didn't have to kind of negotiate with, as it were. But I think there is a major need for a reconsideration of the church's views on war and peace. And I think in terms of other issues which are corollaries of that, the Church of England quite rightly had set itself against the arms trade, as had many other churches. But of course, we see arms flowing into Ukraine in abundance at present. It's boom time for arms dealers. And I think all of this, of course, has to be factored into the church's reappraisal of their approach to questions of war and peace, which I think had drifted rather than had moved consciously into what I have called functional pacifism, and which really need a shake-up. There needs to be a thoroughgoing revisiting of these perspectives. And that's not at all to say that pacifism, Christian pacifism, is illegitimate, is something that should be challenged. But I think that, what I'm calling for is really a more thoroughgoing appraisal of possible responses, and one that is informed and intelligent and is really aware of the issues which are driving the foreign policies of authoritarian regimes, not only in Russia and China, but elsewhere.
In terms of the your understanding of the Church of England's response to date, in reaction to the response to the war in the Ukraine, what would you say that it strikes you as remarkably similar in some respect, or dissimilar relative to how the Church of England responded to, say, World War II or the Cold War?
Well, I think one of the issues about the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s and the lifting of, at least temporarily, of the nuclear shadow, etc., and the mood of optimism which that introduced in a church, in terms of the Church of England, which was increasingly globally conscious and conscious of, the wider Anglican communion and the concerns of sister churches within that communion. I think what happened was that in the First and the Second World War, if you look at the leadership of the Church of England as represented, for example, by the two archbishops, there was a fairly, you might say it's predictable, but nonetheless a considered response to those two conflicts, one which was triggered by the invasion of Belgium by Germany in August 1914, the other which was triggered by the invasion of Poland by Germany in September 1939. There was a very clear, if not closely articulated in terms of just war theory, there's a clear response. It was pretty much univocal that Britain in 1914, 1939 was justified in taking up arms. The similar view was taken in 1950 with North Korea's invasion of South Korea, this time in order to uphold the authority of the fledgling United Nations. There was a more convergent approach adopted between church and state. That's not to say that the leadership of the Church of England was marching in lockstep with military strategists or politicians. I think something which is very much underplayed in the literature, which deserves to be stressing more, is the capacity of the churches to be a critical friend, even in the context of armed conflict. I mean, for example, one can look at the view taken by Archbishop Davidson in the First World War of the use of poison gas and also of the use of potentially, in actual fact, it did happen, of the bombing of civilian areas in Germany, although, of course, aerial bombing of civilian targets was very much in its infancy in the First World War. So there were those points of difference. And in the Second World War, Archbishop Temple and the Church of England came out very strongly against something which was known as hate training in the British Army, a method of training which was designed to inculcate a sense of personal hatred towards the enemy. And basically these training methods, which focused on the use of the bayonet, involved copious quantities of all sorts of rather, let's say, dodgy accessories, such as quantities of animal blood, etc. I mean, the Church of England came out very strongly about it. It's not the business of the church to condone the cultivation of hate. Hate is not part of the just war tradition, for example. The just war tradition is rooted in love. And this is contrary to what the Church of England expected its the state to support and for the military authorities to condone. So I think that these sorts of stands should be more widely recognized. Of course, the iconic position taken in retrospect about the Church of England in the First World War is obviously Bishop George Bell's position vis-a-vis strategic bombing. And of course, this is something which has been celebrated in the post-war and nuclear era by Bell's admirers, etc. Now, to say that there was division over this approach among the bishops of the Church of England would be to put it mildly. Archbishop Temple, another, very much a hero of the post-war Church of England, died prematurely, obviously, in 1944. But nonetheless, Temple, who had a often very balanced view of things, wasn't prepared to condemn strategic bombing and basically said in conversation that he didn't see the difference between strategic bombing in the context of the Second World War and the bombardment of medieval cities by catapults in centuries gone by, as it were. They're all indiscriminate, all unpleasant, as it were. Now, the legacy of strategic bombing, of course, haunted the imagination of the Church of England, particularly as the threat of nuclear weapons took that to another level. But I think what we must recognize is that even though the Church of England didn't come out full square against strategic bombing of Germany or indeed Japan during the Second World War, it didn't mean to say that the Church of England was uncritical. And that capacity of being the critical friend, I think, needs to be recognized a little more in the historiography.
Interesting. Okay, so this kind of builds off of what you've been talking about, especially with the nuclear threat that emerged in more, comparatively speaking, more recent wars. But turning now to the broader scope of your research, your work has also examined the fascinating, if alarming and disturbing, period of human history which marked the advent of weaponry endowed with the capacity for not only mass casualties, but indeed the complete annihilation of humankind. As you've studied persons living and writing during this period, have you found that specific doctrines of eschatology, immortality, or something else emerged as salient or otherwise at the forefront of their theological and religious minds, or their ecclesial practice?
Obviously, one of the issues with the rise, for example, of misgivings, obvious and understandable misgivings about the possession of nuclear weapons, let alone the use of nuclear weapons. But it's interesting how classic Christian apocalyptic and that imaginary fed into opposition to nuclear weapons. The early leaders of CND, often represented, for example, people of faith. I think, in actual fact, the one of the first chairs of CND, of course, was Canon John Collins of St. Paul's Cathedral, who had been an RAF chaplain in the Second World War, had opposed strategic bombing. There is certainly a sense in which, the Book of Revelation and other imaginings, Christian imaginings, classic Christian imaginings, feed into visions of a nuclear apocalypse and inform opposition to them. But I think that some of the theology done under this heading was actually quite mundane. If you look at Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher, Archbishop of Canterbury throughout the 1950s, he actually said that as far as he knew, it was not necessarily part of God's plan that God didn't want to see nuclear Armageddon. Maybe that was part of the whole scheme of humanity's history. Now, that might sound incredibly callous to us, etc., but he wasn't an accomplished theologian. He was simply commenting on the fact that, maybe this nuclear era is a sign of, end times. Maybe this is something which is all part, as you say, of an eschatology which, however uncomfortable, was nonetheless working itself out. Another view of this, and again, these are observations, attitudes, which, let's say, a particular tendency of thought on war and peace within the Church of England and other churches doesn't like to focus on. If you look at, for example, Christopher Chavas, the Bishop of Rochester, in the 1950s. He had served as an army chaplain in the First World War. He had been decorated. He had opposed the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. But during the 1950s, he actually began to adopt a pro-nuclear weapons stance, seeing that the threat, and this was seen quite strong, particularly with the Korean War, arguably also with the crushing of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, that, there was the intention centered on Moscow, arguably Beijing as well, to ensure that the world turned communist, and perhaps nuclear Armageddon was a preferable option. Now, we might shrink and recoil from all of this, but this is somebody who is speaking from the experience of two world wars, who, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, had begun to see things in starkly dualistic terms, good and evil, etc. And it's an uncomfortable reflection, but that's what a bishop of the Church of England was saying in the 1950s. And I think, again, what's interesting is the famous debate which was held in the Church of England in the early 1980s in General Synod about the Church and the Bomb Report, which advocated unilateral nuclear disarmament. And I think what basically led Synod to vote this down was the intervention of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Ramsey, who had actually earned a military cross as a tank commander in Northwest Europe in 1944 or 45. The Church of England, in terms of the Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, unique in having a war hero at its head. And basically, Robert Ramsey said he didn't see that unilateralism, even at the time of heightened tensions between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, he didn't see unilateralism as the best guarantee of future peace, or as the best means of avoiding, therefore, nuclear Armageddon. And I think to come from somebody like Ramsey, very respected Archbishop of Canterbury, with a strong military record, and also somebody who had actually killed people. I think this is a very strong personal as well as pastoral intervention.
Yeah.
And I think Ramsey's example, Ramsey's perspective, etc., I think should be understood and comprehended and appreciated more widely perhaps than it is at present. That's not to advocate, and this is the constant problem and Temple was aware of it when he was opposing the pacifists of the late 1930s, and who were basically calling for disarmament and non-resistance to Hitler's Germany, etc. That basically those who say that under certain circumstances, war might be the least worst option are easily opening themselves to charges of being pro-war. Yeah. And Temple was aware of that, and I think commentators since Temple have always run that risk. And I think, you know, in terms of my own work, I have run that risk. I have taken criticism for that. And so really what I'm arguing for is really a greater awareness of the pacificist, rather, it's a hard term to enunciate, the pacificist strand within Anglicanism, within mainstream Christianity, that which holds that war is abhorrent, but at times is arguably the least worst option, and that reality has to be confronted and accepted. And that, of course, is distinct from pacifism per se.
Right. It's interesting. Okay, one final question from me, and then I'll pass over to Victoria. Given your work on the relationships between the church and the armed forces and the activities of each, what are the most significant lessons that you have learned in the course of your research? For example, are there any lessons that you hope would become more widely known by not only members of the church and military, but also by, say, elected government officials and citizens more generally?
I think one of the key realizations in looking at this subject, particularly as it unfolded over more recent decades, is the fact that religious factors are too often, too readily eliminated or filtered out of our analysis of contemporary conflicts. I think we're locked in a Western paradigm of secularization. Somehow religion is becoming more redundant, more marginal. Therefore, we don't really need to think about it and its effects in other contexts. Now, I think one of the lessons, which is a homegrown lesson, which comes across from the experience of British forces in Afghanistan, for example, as recently as the past few years, is the importance of vigil services, repatriation services, the need for religion to provide some kind of explanatory framework, some kind of comfort, even for a largely post-Christian generation in that context. You know, that religion is still a significant element in sustaining morale on operations. And I think there was some surprise in how far that actually came through in the context of Afghanistan, with, according to surveys, even personnel who regarded themselves as atheists saying that they acknowledged the value of repatriation services, services of remembrance, the presence of chaplains, etc. So that's one thing that we can actually use as a take-home in the British context, one arguably of many. But the idea that, you know, religion began to resurface as a factor in conflicts with which, in this case, the UK was involved from 2001 onwards with 9/11. I mean, that's completely spurious. Obviously, it was present very strongly in Bosnia, in Kosovo, it's present in Northern Ireland, it's present in Cyprus. These religious factors have never disappeared. But somehow, as a secular mindset, a secular filter has been applied to the minds of civil servants, politicians, church people, military people, which refuse to see these factors. I mean, one of the interesting pieces of evidence from Afghanistan, which has always intrigued me, was the way in which, when on the ground, British officers seeking to engage with civilian leaders in Afghanistan found that there was very little opposition if they happened to bring a chaplain with them. In fact, there was a certain amount of interest in having a chaplain, not hostility towards a chaplain because they were overwhelmingly likely to be Christian. There's no hostility there. The real hostility lay towards those people who seemed to disavow any kind of belief. Because not only did that, as it were, represent, the ultimate act, as it were, of blasphemy, profanity, as it were, but also it was redolent of the attitude and mindsets of the Soviets in the earlier Afghan conflict.
Right.
So I think the idea that advocating for no religious position is somehow neutral and will go down well with everybody is nonsense. I think there has to be a far more intelligent appraisal and understanding of the fact that where the West has led, arguably in terms of perspectives on religion, the rest of the world will not necessarily follow, and in fact will, in many circumstances, positively react against that. So I think a more complex, nuanced, and full understanding of the role of religion as driving factors within conflicts, as well as sustaining factors within conflicts, really does need to be grasped at all sorts of levels in the public square, and in all sorts of corners, I should say, in the public square.
Fantastic. I'll pass it over to Victoria now.
Thank you so much. I just want to ask one follow-up that has really that comes from your last response, and I'm completely fascinated by the way in which religion was used so easily in the Cold War by the West, and particularly Christianity. Mark Palmer recently wrote a book about the Cold War radio, and he said his last chapter on religion and the way in which the radios used religious broadcasting is the most important chapter of his book, and yet no one has paid any attention to it. It is the most ignored chapter of his book, may I say, which completely runs parallel to what you're saying. But what I find quite paradoxical is that during the Cold War, it was the atheist Soviets and Lenin saying that religion was the opiate of the masses, which gave the West such great purchase and, in a sense, both true religious power, but also the secularization of that rhetoric became both powerful and toxic. So I was wondering, and then now there seems to be this really interesting switch. So I was wondering if you could speak about the way in which in the post-Cold War, religion has been instrumentalized by those who were pro-atheist, as it were, in the East.
Mm-hmm. So could I just clarify your question when you say that it has been instrumentalized by those? Oh, so this is an allusion to Putin?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, fair enough. Well, I think there was another kind of statement by Lenin which said religion is like a nail. The harder you hammer it, the deeper it goes, as it were. And I think that one of the fascinating developments globally in terms of the religious landscape over the past 30 years has been the resurgence of religion, or at least religious identity, in the post-communist world. I mean, we obviously, with the Balkan civil wars ushered in by the collapse of Yugoslavia in the early 90s, we'd seen a society which had been held together by a communist system for nearly 50 years break apart along old ethnic and religious lines. And the ferocity of that conflict in a society which had been, subscribed nominally at least to an atheistic ideology for decades, and the religious aspects of that conflict, the deliberate destruction of your opponent's places of worship, be they churches or mosques, the desecration of cemeteries, etc., the old characterizations which seem to spring from a forgotten past, but just basically ran to the fore again in Kosovo in the later 90s or mid to late 90s. We saw, the resurrection of a Serbian nationalism, or the reassertion of a Serbian nationalism, which turned very much on the sacrifice of saint, in inverted commas. Well, in the Serbian Orthodox Church, he's regarded as a saint, so I think we should recognize that. Saint Lazar, the king of Serbia, who died fighting the Turks at the Battle of Kosovo, etc., that these old tropes reasserted themselves with surprising violence and rapidity in the light of the collapse of that system. And again, in the Soviet Union, obviously, the emergence of the Russian Federation with Russia at the head of that. But who could doubt the power and strength of Russian Orthodoxy as an ethnic identifier? The fact that Putin, I mean, ostensibly, as I understand, his mother was a believer, and he has always been a closet believer despite his links with the KGB, etc. But in a sense, that exposes some of the anomalies of the communist system. You know, it's often been argued that what defeated the Wehrmacht, what defeated Nazi Germany and its allies in the war on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 45, wasn't communism, it was Russian nationalism. And, you know, the fact that the Great Patriotic War, as it's styled today, saw Soviet tanks rumble into Berlin emblazoned with the Orthodox cross. Some of them had actually been paid for through collections taken by the re-emergent Orthodox Church, which Stalin had basically released from the shadows after the intense persecution of the 1930s. The fact that Georgy Zhukov, the ultimate Red Army general of the Second World War, is now claimed as being a closet believer by his daughter. Again, this fits the narrative of Putin's Russia. But the creation or the building quite recently of a massive military memorial cathedral on the battlefield of Kursk in 1943, that kind of vast slogging match between the Red Army and the Wehrmacht, July 1943. I don't know how many Soviet soldiers who died at Kursk would have thought they would ever be remembered as heroes of Russian Orthodoxy. You know, particularly as many of them would have been at least historically Muslim or even Buddhist, as it were, Jewish. But nonetheless, this is a memory that has been appropriated. But there was always a certain degree of constancy there, that Orthodoxy still had the power to mobilize Russians, even in the Stalinist era, even in that, well, perhaps even because, really, of that moment of crisis. It's interesting, it's in the moment of peace, or relative peace in the 1960s, after, like 50s and 60s rather, with the Soviet Union rebuilding itself, and not actually involved in such an existential conflict, with the rollback of the Stalinist legacy that Khrushchev renews the persecution of religion. But I think the example of the Soviet Union and what Putin is tapping into today, that's always been an undercurrent, and a very strong and powerful undercurrent, I think, in Russian life. And Russian nationalism, heavily inflected and in fact defined by a sense of Orthodox distinctiveness, I think really has served as a very powerful mobilizing factor in the contemporary conflict, which we can come to. But I think it's always been there. It's always been a reservoir that even the most unlikely characters could tap.
That's really fascinating. Maybe we need some more studies of Christian Orthodoxy.
I think, Victoria, you're absolutely right. I think perhaps the Christian tradition which is least understood in the West is Orthodoxy in all its forms, in its national forms. And I think one of the problems actually with the ecumenical movement in certainly post-Second World War, and perhaps this is a problem with ecumenical and interfaith dialogue per se, is that concerned people talk to each other, talk to like-minded people, but the question of religious identity as opposed to theology, as understood in the academy and understood in clergy circles, etc., you might even say elite circles, the idea of identity isn't really tapped or engaged with sufficiently. And I think this came across when I worked for a time on the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and I was teaching on this subject, etc., that the sense of Protestant identity felt in East Belfast, Protestant East Belfast, was not the sense of Protestant identity necessarily felt by an assembly of more liberal and informed Protestant clergy, be they Presbyterian, Methodist, or Church of Ireland. That there was something different, qualitatively different, about that sense of identity and belonging between clergy and laity, but not, that might be too crude a distinction. But the idea of religious identity, speaking about that, almost a kind of a dirty concept. But the fact that the identity that's being stirred by Putin at present has little to do with the world of inter-church dialogue. It has an awful lot to do with the sense of Holy Mother Russia, the distinctiveness of Orthodoxy, the felonious, the suspect nature of other traditions, be they Catholic or Protestant, the sense of Orthodoxy rooted in a belief of the exceptional quality of Orthodox Russia, and the hostility which other parts, even of the Christian world, have always manifested towards it. I think, yeah, we really do need to understand the more visceral aspects of religion and religious identity on the ground. I think that that's not really adequately done at present. We have to name the uglier aspects of traditions with which we engage, and indeed our own tradition.
Fascinating. Yes, and it would seem that the kind of the washing of Soviet or of former of Christian Orthodoxy during the Cold War, led the U.S. not to study it very much at all.
Well, I mean, I'm saying, and I think perhaps in the US, perhaps more so than even in the UK. The First Amendment and the tendency to try and sidestep religious concerns, considerations. I mean, to use it for propaganda purposes, but also treat it in a very ginger sort of fashion. Yeah. I think what's very interesting is that I did hear a critique made of American State Department officials in Afghanistan. This is purely anecdotal, and I'm not but essentially that to try and reduce everything to a question of economic development. And a reluctance really to engage with the particular religious culture, the ecology of that religious culture on the ground in rural Afghanistan. It requires real study and understanding and empathy. And I think the problem is, in a secular world where people are being brought up to see the world, or trained to see the world through a secular lens, I think it's wholly inadequate to understand the world in which we live, particularly after the Iranian Revolution, etc., seemed to reset the politics of the Muslim world, etc. And obviously the politics of the Orthodox world have been reset, really, arguably, with the rise of Putin. And of course, in making the appeal not only to fellow members of the Russian Orthodox Church, when Putin employs his anti-Western rhetoric, he's also tapping into resentment in Serbia at the intervention of NATO in Kosovo, for example, the bombing of Serbia by NATO, the idea that here we have these Westerners again elbowing in and trampling over us and having no sense of our history or identity, etc. And again, if you want to look at the way in which Putin has weaponized religious questions, you will be familiar last Friday, in fact, for the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, the Archbishop of Canterbury wrote a piece for the Daily Telegraph in which he said that Ukraine had to be supported militarily, and that the act of Putin in invading Ukraine is, as we've said, an act of great evil. So there's been commentary from Anglican circles on Putin, but there's also been commentary from Putin on the Anglican Communion. And only last week, for example, he said, well, referring to the divisions in the Anglican Communion over gay marriage and the question, as Putin sees it, of a gender-neutral God, he has deployed this rhetoric and deployed this critique to rally conservative support among Christians in the majority world. And of course, one of the other aspects of Putin's religious policy, which we forget, is the way in which he has courted Muslim opinion in Russia, particularly in Chechnya. He sees himself as a religious conservative and presents himself as a religious conservative who is opposed to innovation as he sees it in the West, and behind whom believers in the majority world can rally, whether they are Christian or Muslim. He's played a very shrewd geopolitical religious game. And again, the fact that many of us have scarcely even registered or even recognized that is, I think, a reflection of how much we are locked into our own paradigms and locked into our own, in actual fact, very limited horizons.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I had never put together the bonding of the Muslim population and beliefs, because certainly in the Cold War, the U.S. attempted to do that. I'm not sure if
Yes,
it did a very good
absolutely.
job, but yeah.
But you're right. He in many respects he's flipped this, and although we are aware of the building of many new churches, many of them very grandiose, including a church, a cathedral, as I understand, dedicated to the military, and this is not the one at Kursk that I mentioned, or I don't think it is. But basically, there have also been the building of mosques in Moscow, particularly large one, quite recently, etc. And so Putin is actually reaching out to constituencies which you said the West played upon during the Cold War era. He understands the geostrategic value of this in many respects, has turned the narrative. It's a fascinating subject. It's ominous because, of course, for many people in the West, the fact that Putin is courting religious opinion across many parts of the world, across religious divisions, it might seem completely incidental to our understanding of the world. But I think that shows just how much we misunderstand the world in which we live and the direction of global affairs.
Yeah, no, it's to me, it's fascinating. I study soft power and, the kind of the cultural use,
Oh,
in a sense. And
absolutely.
yeah, and Orban as well.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
there. Well, anyway, I wanted to also go back to this moment of the end of the Second World War. We spoke about nuclear Armageddon, but I'm always fascinated by Einstein and his religious beliefs. But what about the Jewish question? How does this fit in? I mean, now in the U.S., we see, conservative Christians bonding with many of the conservative Jewish population. There was intense anti-Semitism, obviously, in the world and in the United States before and during World War II. And then there's the shock of the Holocaust, almost like a double shock of nuclear Armageddon and the Holocaust. Could you discuss that a bit?
I'm not terribly familiar with the way in which the state of Israel Jewish identity is played in global affairs, but I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that you're right. I mean, I can speak more, I think, to the British context in this regard. That, of course, one of the pivotal moments in the history of the creation of the state of Israel and its subsequent history was, of course, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and basically the attempt by the British government of the time to rally Jewish opinion across the world behind the Allied war effort. So again, we see the instrumentalization, as it were, of religious communities, widely dispersed religious communities, widely diffused but influential religious communities. And the fact that that particular endorsement of a Zionist future for that corner of the world also played and was related to the recruitment of specifically Jewish units for the British Army, which Jews from the United States and indeed from across other parts of the world actually joined, those who were inspired by a Zionist vision, which the British government at that point seemed to underwrite. So I think, and again, what this feeds into, of course, are much bigger geostrategic questions. And I think, obviously, one of the factors which made the West so supportive, the United States so supportive of Israel after independence, or after the creation of Israel, was, of course, the fact that the Soviets were really backing many of the Arab nations, such as Egypt under Nasser, Syria, etc. So in a sense, it was part of what you might call the Cold War proxy war between the great powers, between Moscow and Washington, as it were. But as to broader issues or wider issues, I can't really speak beyond that. It's not really my field. But again, I would point, as we've looked at Putin's approach to geopolitical affairs today, to global considerations, global calculations, etc., in explaining that, though obviously accepting that there's a huge amount of popular support at home for that stance vis-a-vis Israel and its existence and indeed continued survival.
One of your responses to Dallas's question to me brought in one of my questions, which more broadly looks at kind of the universality of spiritual lives versus, you know, an attachment to a specific religion. You know, what is your understanding of the history of how particular pastors or people from a particular church or denomination would work with people in warfare? Is there kind of a state of an emergency that brings together a universal spirituality that we can tap into, or is that kind of a global myth?
No, it's a very interesting question, and I think that if we again go back to the phenomenon of ecumenism, particularly as its emergence as an ecumenical movement in the 20th century, I think that although certainly the Edinburgh Missionary Conference of 1910 has been seen as a major staging post in the rise of the ecumenical movement internationally, I think what I would argue is that conflict has always had a certain ecumenical dynamic, certainly in terms of my own studies of Great Britain and the United States. And what I mean by that is it's surprising just how differences dissipate when somebody else is actually shooting at you. And the fact that that ecumenical experience, that interfaith experience, was had by millions of people in Great Britain and the United States in the First World War, in the Second World War, and indeed in previous generations. I mean, one of the events in the religious history of Great Britain, which we'll be marking towards the end of this decade, is the bicentenary of Catholic emancipation, which occurred in 1829, the granting of full political rights to Roman Catholics after centuries of prescription or basically second-class status. Now, there is an Irish nationalist myth which turns on the idea that this is a result of campaigning by the Catholic Association led by Daniel O'Connell, the first mass movement that used protests and demonstrations as we would understand it in British history, the most successful certainly of the 1820s. But what that ignores is the fact that for several decades prior to emancipation in 1829, the British Army had to recruit very heavily among Irish Catholics, because basically Britain was short of bodies to fight its wars. And essentially, if you have an army which by 1830 is approximately 40% composed of Irish Roman Catholics, you have to give a little. And particularly if you fought during the Napoleonic Wars against Catholic allies, Spain, Portugal, and in the 1790s had even sent troops to protect the Pope. You know, the French Revolution actually reset the sense of confessional difference, I think, in Great Britain. And there were military routes related in the experience of conflict to that broadening of political society in Great Britain, to the growing acceptance of Roman Catholics in British political life and British society. And again, that's an inconvenient narrative for many people because it cuts against an Irish nationalist narrative. It actually sees religious toleration as rooted in conflict, which is an awkward equation, really. But again, if you look forward to the First World War in Great Britain and you look at the way in which chaplains of all traditions cooperated, I'm not trying to paint a roseate picture, there were tensions, there were conflicts, but nonetheless, the idea of rubbing along together, partly because the military authorities required you to, I mean, that's an important incentive in and of itself. But the other fact, I mean, again, this is, you mentioned the American case, the Second World War, and the celebration of the fruition, the flowering, the flourishing, as it were, of Tri-Faith America in the context of the US Armed Forces of the Second World War. The idea that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, to use that tripartite division, popularized in the 1950s, could serve together in huge numbers to combat a common enemy, which was Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, could suffer together and could actually see just how relatively small their differences were on certain levels, but not quite the narcissism of minor differences, but the fact that you had far more in common with the people next to you than you had actually appreciated from civilian life, which was often more polarized and pillarized in religious terms, that you could actually be being looked after according to practice in the US Army and Navy by a chaplain of a completely different tradition. But he, and I do use that term advisedly, he was your chaplain, and you would likely to form some kind of rapport with him. And that kind of pragmatic, practical ecumenism, I think, has been underplayed in the history of the ecumenical movement and rooted, as I've mentioned, in conflict at the grassroots level, is something which is uncomfortable for the history of that movement, but I think it's something which should be recognized.
Thank you. Really interesting. It's turning specifically to your book, God and Uncle Sam. You have, and this is something we also touched on when you were speaking to Dallas. You argued vehemently against standard separation of church and state tropes. Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Well, I think one of the key things about the separation of church and state, the idea of the First Amendment, etc., religious tests within the Constitution, it's often been more notional than real. And I think that what we saw in the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was an Episcopalian, brought up in a very kind of world of Anglophilia, really, the Episcopal Church at the turn of the 20th century, education at Groton, everything else, you know, there was very much an English influence to American Episcopalianism, which was reflected in the attitudes and outlook of Roosevelt himself. And I think that the fact that the Episcopal Church at the beginning of the 20th century was seeking to be the first among equals among America's churches, that the building of the National Cathedral with the support of Congress, it's a slightly odd phenomenon if you see what I mean, but that kind of blurring of the lines, I think, was very common among Episcopalians of his generation. And so, for example, Roosevelt, as president, as commander-in-chief, as it were, is very keen on further blurring these lines by the massive provision for religion through the US Armed Forces, the building of hundreds of chapels, purpose-built chapels, which had never existed before for the US military, the distribution of scripture in Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish versions to GIs, etc., the superabundance of chaplains which are provided by the US military for the care of its soldiers, for its care of its men and women. And again, one of the people who's complicit in this, of course, is George C. Marshall, another Episcopalian. So essentially, if you get particular individuals in powerful positions who were brought up in a particular stable with a particular view of the way in which the state should relate to the church, and I think there's more of a Church of England colouring to Episcopalianism at this time, a kind of quasi-establishment feeling. It does affect military policy, and again, I'd refer to the Cadet Chapel at the Naval Academy at Annapolis and the Cadet Chapel at the Military Academy at West Point. You know, until the middle years of the 20th century, very Episcopalian in terms of their ethos. In fact, there was a bit of an Episcopalian stranglehold on the chaplaincy at West Point. And Morris Yanovitz in the 60s undertook a very interesting survey whereby he established that 50% of America's generals and admirals since 1890 had actually been Episcopalians, and Episcopalians represented only 1% or 2% at most of the US population. So I think I was fascinated when writing God and Uncle Sam by how much a particular church with its ethos and traditions had infiltrated the American establishment, and how people of that background were able to shape policy in a society in which, of course, constitutionally church and state were meant to be separate, etc., and to do it so brazenly, and to do it in actual fact with the approbation of the vast majority of the American public, because American secularist groups in challenging this, and there were attempts to do this in the 1940s, got absolutely nowhere. because, of course, the nation is at war. You know, millions of men and women are overseas. Hundreds of thousands are dying. I mean, it's not really the time to have this kind of conversation. So it's a fascinating picture, and I think also, again, in terms of the role of religion and global affairs, I think had Roosevelt not been Episcopalian, had he not been so pro-British, I mean, he was accused of speaking with an affected English accent. If you listen to his particular, patter, that basically, if you didn't have somebody in that position when France was defeated in 1940 and Britain stood alone and Lend-Lease was a hot button issue in the United States, somebody who was personally committed to supporting Great Britain as a Christian democracy and also a historically predominantly Anglican country, I think that factored into his considerations. But if you look at the Placentia Bay meeting of August 1941, when Churchill met Roosevelt, and the famous footage of them on the deck of the Prince of Wales, and they're actually attending a naval service which British sailors and American sailors and Marines are present. It's presided over, it's an Anglican service, inevitably presided over by an Anglican New Zealand chaplain, as it were. They sing the Navy hymn, "O God our help in ages past." From an Anglican stable, they sing "Onward Christian Soldiers," and basically they represent to the world, this is for world consumption, a sense of democratic and Christian solidarity, but also one which is very subtly and very significantly Anglican.
That's fascinating, it also jumps into the role of philanthropy and business leaders as well in the United States with Rockefellers.
Yes, absolutely, and J.P. Morgan and all of this sort of thing. Yeah, I mean the shadow establishment, if you will, of Episcopalianism in early 20th century America, and the fact that I don't think that's really been engaged with by religious historians to the extent that it might be, actually.
Yeah, it's fascinating. A general question in terms of your writing and your research. How do you use, you've got such an incredible command of sources and access to documents and people and what they've said. Can you talk about your use of archives and sources, and also the difference between the United States and the UK and the use of sources, finding sources?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that one of the things I've discovered and obviously this came to the fore with COVID, but I was aware of it before then, is how much better libraries and archives in the United States are, as a rule, in terms of making their collections available. That far more had been digitized, the sort of material I was looking for, in the United States than had been in the UK. The Imperial War Museum, which I think is one of the prime archives on this, naturally enough, for the study of conflict and war, which has quite a lot of religious content in its collections. It's making a determined effort at the digitalization of its collections, but it's not gone quite as far as the United States or Australia seems to have done. I think the larger the country, obviously, the more scattered your potential users are, and perhaps the greater is the felt need to make that material available. We're very London-centric in Britain, and certainly the idea that you just have to jump on a train and go down and look at the London archives, that's only slowly shifting. But I think that's been one of the differences between the two countries in that regard. I think also one of the aspects which comes through about the organization of collections is that I was brought up in the school of the social history of religion, and to a certain extent British collections, I'm thinking here not only of the Imperial War Museum but of the Little Collection at the University of Leeds, etc., seem to be more geared towards that approach to history than American collections are. There are collections of personal experience of 2 world wars in the US, as it were, but in Britain there was, I think, an earlier push to kind of democratize the history of these conflicts and to make those sources available. That's my impression. But certainly, I didn't come across an archive like the Imperial War Museum, which had literally the materials of thousands of people from all sorts of backgrounds, so readily accessible in a US context.
That's really fascinating because, it goes right to E.P. Thompson, yes, and social history, and also questions of where people put things.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, and how things are catalogued as well. I think that one of the things about, and here anybody who's considering writing about chaplaincy, and obviously because it does feature not necessarily in the history of religious experience in the military, you'll find, on the other hand, that the National Archives in the United States have done a much better job at concentrating chaplaincy records than have the British. In actual fact, to write a history, for example, of RAF or Royal Naval chaplaincy is extremely difficult because the materials are just so scattered, where indeed they even exist. And in actual fact, assembling and mapping and identifying the sources, even for army chaplaincy in the UK, has been a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. And we know a lot more about where these sources lie now than we did 20 years ago, because there seemed to be a void, to be quite honest. Whereas if you went to the National Archives, College Park, Maryland, you'll get the chaplain's records for the US, in bulk, meters and meters and meters and meters of the stuff. And so I think that's another kind of contrast, is that in terms of the retention of official records, institutional records on that level, I think the US is better than the UK. So it's an odd kind of picture of convergence and divergence, as it were, in that regard.
Fascinating. We don't want to keep you for too long, so I'll just ask the final question, which is, what questions have we missed? What have we missed? What would you like to say?
That's a very interesting. That's a very, very interesting question. I think we've pretty much said. I mean, maybe something a little more about memorialization, and only for a couple of minutes, and simply that the way in which the subject area with which myself and others have been engaged for more than 20 years now, the way in which it's had to struggle to kind of find some kind of recognition, I think is reflected in the fact that although it's an elephant in the room, although the religious dimensions of conflict are perennial, almost universal, and whether it's the 16th century or whether it's the early 21st century, you'll find this material, you'll find its significance. It's reflected in the fact that, although if you go into not only major Anglican or Church of Scotland churches in England and Scotland, or Church of Ireland churches in Ireland, you'll find many of them have so many military memorials. The major churches will have military chapels, etc. But this aspect of these faith communities' history, their traditions, their formative influence, despite the fact that they are so visible, they're so obvious, they're so little studied. They're incidental details, they're pushed to one side, etc. And I think that, if anything, if the work of myself and many other colleagues in recent years helps faith communities to really understand the significance and the formative influence, for good or for ill, of conflict in their history, then I think it's worthwhile. There's so much more really to be engaged with, and I think also one has to avoid what one great historian said, about the great condescension we can show to our past. I think often it's very easy, particularly in studying the history of conflict and the churches, to point the finger at certain individuals and say you made a wrong call then, as it were. But I think I've never been convinced that we're necessarily more enlightened when it comes to judging our contemporary situation than those individuals in the First World War or Second World War were, and that posterity, I'm sure, will point an accusatory finger at us. And I think we just need to be a little more humble in viewing our subjects and in understanding the situations that they were placed in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for some really, really fascinating questions, and I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, so thanks very much for speaking with us today, Professor Snape. We've really appreciated getting to hear your thoughts on the historical and the theological and religious contours of warfare in the modern world here today.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.